What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I'm finally back with another discography ranking for you guys. It's been a couple of months, and we are kicking off the new year of discography rankings with a ranking that's been long awaited and needed to happen for a long time. I am going to be talking about all 16 and ranking all 16 studio full-lengths from death metal legends Cannibal Corpse. And yeah, this is a ranking I've wanted to do for a long time, and I figured I'd wait until the new album came out back in September, I believe. So here we are talking about all 16 Cannibal Corpse albums. So, how I got into Cannibal Corpse. Pretty much as I keep talking about with most death metal bands I've been ranking on here, it goes back to high school, back in sophomore, junior year of high school, when I was really starting to dive into more metal genres that weren't classic metal and thrash metal. And Cannibal Corpse was among the earliest death metal bands that I really got into. And of course, one of the cool things that I learned with Cannibal Corpse that, of course, they were in Ace Ventura: Pet Detective all those years before, which I thought was pretty fucking cool. So, and I've been a big fan of them pretty much ever since. And without further ado, let's get into the ranking and the history of Cannibal Corpse. So, we kick off before Cannibal Corpse even existed. We have to go back to around 1985, where three close friends, Chris Barnes, Paul Mazurkowitz, and Rich Ziegler, were all just hanging out together, listening to all sorts of tunes, and playing air guitar and air drum and air singing, and they thought, why don't we give it a shot for real? So they decided to form a band with Paul on drums, Rich on bass, and Barnes as the frontman. And eventually they would get also high school classmate Bob Rousset to be the guitarist and form Tyrant Sin. And this was all happening up in Buffalo, in which this was kind of the beginning of the entire Buffalo metal scene as a whole. And at the same time as Tyrant Sin going on, you had Alex Webster, Jack Owen, and their friend Darren Pfeiffer form Beyond Death, which was kind of in a similar vein to Tyrant Sin, kind of like deathly, thrashy, extreme metal. And then you had Rob Barrett in a band called Dark Deception. So it's like these three bands, and as well as Barnes leaving Tyrant Sin for a short period to join another band called Leviathan. So it was really these four bands that would make up Cannibal Corpse early on. So they were just playing local shows and just doing all sorts of crazy stuff all over the Buffalo scene. So they were just all doing their own things and rehearsing at the good old Absolute Storage facility up in Buffalo. And eventually, Tyrant Sin would fall apart after Rich would quit, and then Beyond Death would fall apart after Darren and another member they had wanted to do more crossover thrash stuff, and then Dark Deception and Leviathan broke up, so it left pretty much everybody, the main ones, Barnes, Mazurkowitz, Rousset, Webster, and Owen, pretty much free to do whatever they wanted. So they called up each other and were like, why don't we form a band with the five of us? And the band would form in 1988, and eventually Alex would come up with the name Cannibal Corpse, which people say, well, what is a cannibal corpse? Just an undead zombie that wants to eat people. That's pretty much that. So they formed in 88, and then sometime in early 89 they would record and release their legendary demo that really circulated around the States and eventually wound up in the hands of Mike Faley, who's an executive over at Metal Blade Records, and then he sent the tape over to Brian Slagle, the owner of Metal Blade, and Brian just thought, this just sounds awesome, and I really should sign this band based on the title, A Skull Full of Maggots. So just off of that principle, he decided to sign Cannibal Corpse, which was the first death metal band on Metal Blade Records, since Metal Blade was mostly known for signing thrash and classic metal bands a la Slayer, Flotsam and Jetsam, and Sacred Reich in particular. But they would go to Metal Blade, and what a good place to go, I must say myself. But not long after signing Metal Blade, they began playing bigger shows, opening for bigger bands like Dark Angel, Coroner, and Creator in particular. And then, after doing some early local shows, they decided, well, since we're on Metal Blade, we need to start recording some music. And they were already getting into the Florida death metal scene with the early material, like from Death and Morbid Angel, Atheist, Obituary. And it wasn't until after hearing Sepultura's Beneath the Remains that they thought, you know what? Let's make the road trip from Buffalo all the way down to Tampa, go to More Sound Studios, get Scott Burns to record with us, and we'll be on our way. Basically, they would just call More Sound, be like, hey, is Scott Burns there? Asking him, hey, would you like if we came down? Scott's like, hell yeah, come on down, this should be killer. So they make the long trip for the big vacation down to Tampa and to record their debut album. And eventually released in 1990, we get the debut album, Eaten Back to Life. This one lands as my number 8 album. I actually really love this album, and what's unique about this album in comparison to the rest of the material in Cannibal Corpse's back catalog, this is definitely more thrash metal inspired. Like, there's a ton of thrashy nods, particularly to German thrash like Creator and Sodom, but also a good amount of Slayer, but it's still very much death metal, just with some thrashy overtones to it. And like Barnes' vocals aren't as low as they would end up getting, but I just love the raw energy of this album. Songs like Shredded Humans, Edible Autopsy with that badass triplet chug, Scattered Remains, Splattered Brains, and A Skull Full of Maggots. All these songs just rip at your face and eats it alive right in front of you. And of course, beginning the long-standing relationship with one Vincent Locke, doing the album art pretty much for every single album. And it's crazy to think that Vincent Locke has been doing these covers now for 34 years now for Cannibal, which is insane. But hey, kudos to the band and to Vincent for keeping such a great relationship going. And so yeah, Eaten Back to Life, yeah, not as refined songwriting as they would end up having starting probably with the next album. Definitely some more melody kind of pops up here, but I just love that thrashy energy about it, and that's why it lands as my number 8. Now, as far as any stories, so to say, there's really not any stories at all. That's just write, record, tour, pretty much the entire way through this discography. So there's really going to be no stories to talk about here, except for when we get to a few. So they were just, again, doing some light touring on the side, and then they would go back down to Tampa just a year later to record their next album. And this one would definitely signal a big change for Cannibal Corpse. They got better as songwriters and as musicians, so they wanted to go into this album with even more brutality laced. And released in 1991, we would get Butchered at Birth. Now, this album has some killer tracks. I do love this album when it comes... I love all these albums, and some killer tracks like Meat Hook Sodomy, Gutted, Covered with Sores, and especially Vomit the Soul, which features good old Glenn Benton from Deicide doing some vocals, doing the more higher demonic vocals along with Barnes' vocals, which Barnes, by this point, his register got lower, really guttural, and people kind of looked at Barnes as one of the pioneers of guttural vocals. Well, along with Frank Mullen and Joe Ficek, but that's a debate for another time. Who truly created the super low gutturals? That's up for debate, but I digress. So while there are some killer songs, this album lands as my number 12. And it's mostly because this is arguably the worst produced album in the catalog. And it's weird because it's Scott Burns again, but here he didn't quite do as good of a job. But it was mostly down to the guitar tone and the drum tones. Like, the guitar tones were very gainy and really too much on the high end when it comes to the tone. The drum tones were okay, but there were times where it would kind of just overpower everything. And it's weird because 1991, Scott Burns produced some excellent albums, you know, Death Human, Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten, Sepultura Arise. All these albums came out in 91, and those three were produced excellently. This one, I don't know what happened, just doesn't sit right with me when it comes down to the production. But the songwriting definitely got a little bit better. Definitely more straight up death metal, dare I say brutal death metal, kind of like with Suffocation and even Broken Hope at this point. But yeah, some of the nuances was gone with those thrash elements, and some of the melody goes away, but you make up for it with more brutality and aggression. But overall, the album lands as my number 12 just due to the production being the way it was. But after doing Butchered at Birth, they would finally get to tour outside of America, doing a European tour, and then get to come over to do their first proper North American tour in early 1992. But not long after the tours, back to the studio, back down to Tampa, back to Scott Burns we go, and released in 1992, we would get Tomb of the Mutilated. This is my number 3. This is still a classic album to this day. After all, the opening, Hammer Smash Face. Name me a metalhead that has never heard that song. Like, come on. If you're a heavy metal fan, you have to have heard Hammer Smash Face. It's one of the most iconic death metal songs of all time. It's still thrashy, but it's plenty chuggy, great bass line, and I think with the production, Scott Burns got it right this time. The production was far better on this album. The mix is better, the tones are stronger, and Barnes' vocals even more demonic, if that was even possible. But yeah, other than Hammer Smash Face, some of my personal favorites, I Come Blood, Entrails Ripped from a Virgin's Cunt, and Post-Mortal Ejaculation. Of course, song titles fucking rule throughout pretty much every single one of these albums, and this would end up being the first album cover to have the first album to have an alternate cover, because Butchered at Birth started the controversy, but then it was this album cover that solidified the controversy. It's like, creating alternate covers is like, what the hell? It's like you have the babies on meat hooks on Butchered at Birth, but that's fine, but then you get to this one, wait, is that corpse eating out another corpse? I feel like I'm getting a boner when I shouldn't. This is wrong. So, yeah, I don't know why they wouldn't just come up with an alternate cover for Butchered at Birth, but they did for this. But hey, it is what it is. Fuck censorship, I'll be honest, when it comes to certain aspects, especially art like this. But whatever. But still, this album kicks ass. My number 3. So, after doing touring once again for this album, then we get to around mid to late 1993, where we would get, a couple of big things. First, we would get a lineup shift. Well, they would record their Hammer Smashed Face EP in early 1993, re-releasing the single Hammer Smash Face, but doing 2 covers of Possessed, The Exorcist, and Black Sabbath, Zero to Hero. However, it was during the recording of this EP that Bob's guitar chops just weren't quite matching up to Jack, and so while Bob was away, the band would actually have Jack do the solos, because Jack was the stronger guitarist. While Bob had the energy, his chops weren't as strong as Jack, which ended up leading the band to make the tough choice to kick Bob out of the band due to his musicianship skills not developing as quickly as everybody else. And Bob was pretty upset about it, and I don't think he's talked to the band at all to this day about it. So, yeah, kind of an unfortunate breakup, since Bob was an original member, a founding member of the band, and was one of the most likable guys in death metal. And because his chops just weren't as strong, they had to do something. So in his place would be one Rob Barrett, who was already close with the guys from the very beginning, considering they were all from the same area. However, Rob was already living down in Miami and playing with Malevolent Creation at this point, another Buffalo death metal band, underrated. But Rob would eventually join Cannibal Corpse full time, and then it was not long after Rob joined would come the big gig for doing the scenes for Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. And Originally, Jim Carrey, he wanted Napalm Death to do the movie, but they turned it down, so Jim would go ask for Cannibal Corpse, and Cannibal was like, well, two things. We want to make sure we don't look dumb in this movie, and also, can we wait until after we finish our tour? And Jim and the crew was like, okay, that sounds good. But they got him down there, and while I love the movie Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, it's one of my favorite 90s comedies, those scenes with Cannibal Corpse are something special. So, yeah, and that pretty much broke Cannibal Corpse out into the mainstream somewhat. Granted, no change in music stylings in terms of their heaviness, but it got more people exposed to death metal, which I think is always a good thing. But after the Ace Ventura stuff, then they would return to the studio, back to Tampa, back to more sound, back to Scott Burns, and they were about to craft something quite visceral and fucking crazy. Now, granted, the recording sessions here were a little bit stressful for the guys. In fact, at one point, Scott Burns walked out and said, you know what, mix your own fucking record. I'm out of here. But, of course, all the stress took place. So, yeah, during the sessions for this album, little bit of turmoil happened. But in the end, as Chris Barnes said, it was all worth it. And released in 1994, we would get The Bleeding. This is my number one. I mean, top 10, arguably top 5 death metal album of all time. This album just has everything that I love about death metal. Triplet chugs, thrashy moments, little hints of technicality, but great hooks. But it's still one of the most brutal albums I've ever heard. While you could argue this was their most accessible album because of the catchier riffs, but it's still one of the most brutal albums in death metal history that isn't, quote, brutal death metal. Even though I would still say this is a brutal death metal album. And also, Barnes' vocals, they just keep getting lower. And this was easily, in my opinion, the best vocal performance out of all 4 that Barnes did. Rob Barrett coming in, shredding along and riffing along with Jack Owen. Killer. I mean, the whole album, but some of my favorites in particular. Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead might be my favorite Cannibal Corpse song of all time. Of course, Fucked with a Knife, Stripped, Raped, and Strangled. Return to Flesh, I think, is a very underrated song with an awesome melodic lead in there, too. Force Fed, Broken Glass, An Experiment in Homicide, Pickaxe Murder, She Was Asking For It, the title track, Pulverized, just every song. Fucking check it out if you haven't. If you haven't checked it out, you've been living under a rock for 30 years. Fucking check this album out. This was my favorite album to come out on my birth year of 1994, so that should tell you something. But yeah, this album, and also the production, Scott Burns nailed the production. This is arguably Scott Burns' best production job ever. Fucking incredible. My number one. So, after The Bleeding came out, they would tour quite a lot and eventually make the decision to move from Buffalo and just move to Tampa since they kept going there for so many years. They thought, how about we just live in Tampa? The weather's warmer, less restrictions on certain laws. So how about we just move down here and also we can enjoy nicer weather instead of the bitter cold of Buffalo. So they would move to Tampa at the end of 94 into 95, and then we move into 1995 where the biggest lineup change would happen. So they were already in the studio recording this next album. However, when it came down to lyrics, Alex and Jack and Paul in particular, they wanted to collaborate with Barnes a little bit more when it came to lyrics. And also, they thought his vocals weren't as strong as they were on The Bleeding or any of the other albums prior. And then Barnes had already had 6 Feet Under going, so he's like, you know what, I'll just tour with my other band and I'll come back and finish this album later, which left the band in a bit of a bind, so it led them to make the decision about changing vocalists. And they were thinking of getting some guys, but the number one candidate they wanted was George Corpse Grinder Fisher from Monstrosity. They were already big fans of George when he was in Monstrosity and done 2 unbelievable albums with Monstrosity that you guys should check out if you haven't checked out Monstrosity. And they're an awesome band that deserve more recognition. So they eventually auditioned Corpse Grinder, and George got the job, which George was blown away considering he was already a huge fan of Cannibal Corpse. So he takes over Barnes' spot, and when they called Barnes up, they told Barnes about it, and Barnes like, that's okay, I was gonna quit anyways, so no problems at all. So I guess things ended positively to some extent, like they weren't pissed off at each other, even though there was some issues here and there. But Corpse Grinder in the band, so they would have to start from scratch lyrically, so they had to rewrite the lyrics Barnes had already written. So basically Jack, Alex, and Paul were the main lyric writers for a good long while. But in the end, they would go back to Scott Burns again at More Sound for the recording, and released in 1996, we get Vile. Now this one might be a bit of a spicy take, considering how some people feel about this album. Call me insane, I don't care. This is my number 2. I don't know why this album gets so much shit. Like, I seen even the Thralls guys rank this really low, like even dead last. I'm like, how? How does this get ranked last for a lot of people? I don't get it. The production, while it's a little bit more raw, I like the production on here. It gave them a little more of a brutal vibe in terms of the raw grittiness of it, but also maybe one reason people shit on this album because it's not as groove-laden and as catchy as The Bleeding. Instead, they went for a more aggressive, bludgeoning, and technical approach. Like, this was almost tech death to some degree, but I love this album for the songwriting. Like, it felt like a good contrast to The Bleeding, where The Bleeding was all about, like, let's just write memorable riffs, but stay brutal. It was like, here, let's just get as heavy and as crazy as possible, and let's just go for it. Let's just fucking go for it. And right away, Corpse Grinder's impact is felt immensely with Devoured by Vermin, that big scream, which, of course, the story goes, like, he kept doing so many takes of that scream, couldn't get it right until he decided to take a piss, and then psych himself up in the mirror and be like, this is your fucking shot, don't screw it up. And then right afterwards, he hits that scream, and that's what you hear on the record. But yeah, Devoured by Vermin was probably my favorite, although Bloodlands is a good contender. I love that song. Kind of reminiscent of The Bleeding a little bit, but also Mummified and Barbed Wire is a fucking killer song. Puncture Wound Massacre, it's like maybe a minute and a half, close to 2 minutes, but it is a brutal short song. It's thrashy and just filled with hatred. Absolute Hatred, ironically. That's another killer track. And then also, pretty much by this point, a lot of fucking overly sensitive fucks out there kept wanting to label Cannibal Corpse as misogynist because of the lady torturous album covers. But again, that's horror movie tropes, people. Fucking relax. But they decide, you know what, here, men are getting abused too, with the guy being mummified in barbed wire with his dick cut off. So, yeah, they're basically like, here you go. We can abuse men too. We're not misogynists. We're equalists when it comes to torturing humans. So, there you go. Fuck you, oversensitive motherfuckers, but I digress. So, yeah, this album, again, I don't get why it gets so much hate. I love it. It's my number 2. So, while touring for Vile, the band was noticing that Rob was starting to get a little bit distant from the rest of the guys because there was a bit of a musical difference between the two. Like, Rob was more into the thrashier side of things, while the rest of the guys were going for more straight-on, heavy, technical death metal. And Rob wanted to collaborate more when it came to writing thrashier, groovier material, but the rest of the guys were very adamant about staying where they were, and so Rob just bowed out and left the band. And then they were trying to look for another replacement, and they would eventually pick up Pat O'Brien from Nevermore at this point. And Pat O'Brien comes in and takes over for Rob Barrett and shreds and riffs along with Jack Owen now. So they would return to the studio, back to More Sound we go, but no Scott Burns, because it would be by the time 1998 comes around, where Scott was starting to get a bit disenfranchised with the entire music industry. He was getting sick of being labeled as the death metal guy, so he stopped producing for many years. So while the band stayed at More Sound, they would get Jim Morris, one of the owners of More Sound, to come in and produce, which was a good move considering Jim had already done some excellent production work for bands like Savatage and Iced Earth, and even did the production for Death Symbolic, which that's an amazing production job in of itself. So, good alternative, I would say, to Scott Burns. Easily, in my opinion, the second best producer More Sound ever had. So, Jim Morris takes over for production, and released in 1998, we get A Gallery of Suicide. This is my number 13. This album, while it's still really good, I mean, again, I love all these albums, so to try and rank them was a little bit difficult. But this one definitely falls in the bottom fourth, because while the production's killer, the songs don't stand out as much, but there are some that I enjoy, like the opening, I Will Kill You, is great. Sins to Burn, which is one of the band's most memorable songs, Stabbed in the Throat, but From Skin to Liquid, their first instrumental, that's a killer instrumental, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of bands like Gojira to some degree, and maybe even Decapitated. But yeah, this album, it's really good. It's really good production, but again, following Vile was kind of difficult to do, at least for me, and some of the songs kind of just blend together, but still, it's still a really damn good album, but it just ranks lower as my number 13. And I need a drink of water. So, more touring goes on, and not long after finishing up the tours for Gallery of Suicide, they would go back to the studio. They would not go back to More Sound. Instead, they would go over to Texas at the Sonic Ranch, I believe, and they would work with Colin Richardson, who is, of course, a legendary producer. I mean, I'm not going to name everything he's done, just search him up and you'll see the insane work he has done. So they would work with Colin Richardson on this next album, and release just a year later in 1999, we get Bloodthirst. This one, my number 7. This is a fantastic album. This is the sequel to Vile that I wanted. Corpse Grinder comes alive. Holy shit, the vocals that he's projecting out of his throat are just bleh. And of course, production got much more beefy on this album, and of course with Colin Richardson knowing what the fuck he's doing, just delivers on all fronts. And again, all these songs kill, but some of the notable ones, Unleashing the Bloodthirsty, The Spine Splitter, Blowtorch Slaughter, and Condemned to Agony, like these, but again, all these songs kill. And this album, it just felt like it gained back something that they lost with Gallery of Suicide. Like, there's some more hooks, but it's still very technical and very aggressive for what they were going for here. And with that said, it lands as my number 7. But, bit of a gap, so we're now into the first long break, so it'd be a few years before they would go back to the studio to do the next album, and they were going to use Colin Richardson again, but he backed out, so they would get the one and only Neil Kernon to take over for production. And of course, I talked about him at length during the Deicide ranking, and of course, just look at everything Neil Kernon's done. It's unbelievable. So they would work with Neil Kernon for this next album, and released in 2002, we would get Gore Obsessed. So yeah, one of these albums had to end up in last place, and it's this one. But it's still good. It's still a really good album, but in terms of being the least listened to album, this is among the albums I've listened to the least. And it's mostly because not a whole lot stood out to me about this album, although Again, some good songs on here, like Savage Butchery, the opening track, Dormant Bodies Bursting, Compelled to Lacerate, and When Death Replaces Life. Like, I think those were the big standouts on here, but they just aren't as memorable standouts as some other songs on other albums. And there was a fair amount of repetition on this album. Like, it might have had a little bit of, like, AC/DC syndrome, where there were some songs that kind of sounded really similar to one another. But it's still a good album. Again, I love all these albums, but again, I had to put something in last place, and this was the album. So, sorry, Gore Obsessed fans. I mean, I'm a fan of it, but not as much as other albums. But it is my number 16. So, afterwards, more touring, writing, and recording happens, and they would go back to the studio in 2004, early 2004, I believe, once again with Neil Kernan as the producer, and released in 2004, we would get The Wretched Spawn. This one is my number 9, so it's pretty much right in the middle, but it is a great album. Although I will say, the production, though, I felt was maybe a little too clean for as aggressive as this album gets. Like, this is easily one of the most aggressive and furious Cannibal Corpse albums you're going to hear, but the production might be a little bit too clean and doesn't quite complement what they're going for songwriting-wise that much, but it's still a great album. After all, Decency Defied and Festering in the Crypt, both of those songs Jack Owen wrote, and they were a little more catchy, like a little bit back to the groovier Cannibal Corpse from back in the day, but also They Deserve to Die, but also Frantic Disembowelment, which might be the most technical Cannibal Corpse ever got. Like, this might be one of the best technical death metal songs I ever heard, as Pat just went fucking apeshit with the riffs and the leads. It was like... And even like Alex, Jack, and eventually Rob, whenever they had to learn these parts, they were just like, you really mean to tell us that we gotta work on this shit for days on end? Like, my god. So, Pat was a fucking animal on this album, especially on that song. But yeah, top to bottom, far better than Gore Obsessed, but not as good as some of the other Corpse Grinder albums. But it's my number 9. It's a great album. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, not long after Wretched Spawn came out, kind of similar to what happened with Rob, Jack ended up starting to distance himself from the band because he wanted to explore more musical territory. So he had a band called Adrift going on, but they were about to do some LA shows while Cannibal Corpse was getting ready to do a Mexico tour. And they called up Jack to figure out what the deal was, and Jack's like, I think it's time for me to leave. I just want to do some different stuff. So, Jack leaves Cannibal Corpse, another original member gone. So, it kind of left the band in a bit of a bind, but they would pick up Jeremy Turner from Origin to take over for the tour for the next year, and did a great job, all things considered, when it came to the tours, at least in the footage I've seen of it. And they considered keeping him, but he lived in Kansas, and it would have been a tough decision to have to move from Kansas down to Florida. And at the same time, Rob was reaching out to the rest of the guys about, hey, I kind of feel bad for how I left last time. I would like to come back in. So, welcome back, Rob Barrett, taking now Jack Owen's spot. So, Rob Barrett taking over for both of the original guitarists, Bob and Jack. So Rob Barrett back into the band, here we go. And they would enter the studio. This time they would go over to Mana Recording Studios to work with one, Eric Rutan, who not only a great producer, but amazing guitarist, who was up to this point and already done stuff with Ripping Corpse and Morbid Angel, and also had Hate Eternal going at this point. So Eric would step up to do the production, and released in 2006... we would get Kill. While the album cover, definitely the worst cover of the entire catalog, musically, one of their best. It's my number 4. Welcome back, the old school Cannibal Corpse. Like, more groove is back, but there's still some technical bits, there's some thrash coming in. So this almost feels like an all-encompassing Cannibal Corpse album, and the production... much heavier. Like, this might be the heaviest album, arguably, in the entire catalog, possibly. It's really hard to say because all their albums are heavy, but this might be the heaviest one because Eric Rutan really beefed everything up. And, of course, tracks Make Them Suffer, one of the most memorable songs of the modern Cannibal Corpse era, same with Death Walking Terror, but some of my favorites, Infinite Misery, another awesome instrumental, Five Nails Through the Neck, not George's neck, and Murder Worship for that breakdown in Murder Worship. It's like, holy shit, they're back to getting catchy again, and it's awesome. Can't go wrong. But yeah, the album art, I've talked about the album art at length in one of my videos I did in a past few months. Yeah, the album cover sucks, but the actual artwork's on the interior, which I think would have been far fitting, but I guess Metal Blade or somebody at Metal Blade felt strongly about just having the logo with the word kill as like a big statement. So, yeah, kind of a weird thing with the cover there, but musically, incredible. One of the best, my number 4. So again, touring ensues, and another somewhat long break, as it'd be another few years before the next one comes out. They would go back to the studio once again to mono recording with Eric Rutan, and released in 2009, we get Evisceration Plague. This one fell as well. This is my number 15. This, to use a quote from Necrotic Nick, it's almost like you're going from RoboCop 1, where it's bloody, violent, everybody's dying, to RoboCop 3, it's PG-13, essentially. This is almost like, yeah, this is the diet version of Kill, but it's still good. It's still got some good jams on there. Priests of Sodom, the title track, Scalding Hail, Carrion Sculpted Entity, and Skewered from Ear to Eye. Like, there are some great songs on here, but I don't know. Again, it just feels like a diet version of themselves, and that's kind of odd to say. I mean, it's plenty heavy. It is plenty heavy, but doesn't have a lot of memory for me, and that's why it fell to my number 15. So afterwards, more tours, writing going on, and then they would return to the studio. This time, while still with Eric Rutan, they would go back to the Sonic Ranch, I believe, to do this next album. And then released in 2012, we would get Torture. This one's my number 5. This is the sequel to Kill that should have happened. Like, after Kill, this should have been the follow-up. And this is almost as good as Kill. Like, it definitely feels like Kill Part 2 for sure. But I will say there's maybe a little bit more groove and a little bit more thrashiness coming back on this one. After all, one of the catchiest songs they ever had, Scourge of Iron, is on here. But also, As Deep as the Knife Will Go, The Strangulation Chair, Crucifier Avenged, killer songs on here. Not so much in the song titles. Like, by this point, the song titles started to get a bit tamer, but still great, but just not as crazy as, like, the old titles, like, you know, Postmortal Ejaculation, and so on and so forth. But the gory album art would return. This was the first one since The Wretched Spawn that had a real gory album cover, and this is a really good one. So, Vincent Locke, kudos to you once again for just nailing it every time. But yeah, musically, again, beefier than Evisceration Plague, more memorable songs, more hooks going on here. So, yeah, my number 5. So, little bit of a shorter break we get here. It would only be another 2 years, and they would go back to Florida to record, but this time at Audio Hammer Studios to work with Mark Lewis, who's known for doing production for quite a number of bands, mostly modern extreme metal bands, but Mark Lewis steps up as producer, and released in 2014, we would get A Skeletal Domain. This one did fall a little bit for me. This is my number 10, but I think this might be the most underrated album in the catalog. I think this is a great album. Mark Lewis does a great job, and I like that break from Rutan. So we get a little break from Eric Rutan for this album. And Mark Lewis, while a little bit more polished, it's still gritty sounding. and again, continuing to bring back more groove and more thrash and less of the technicality. I would say the first 3 tracks, one of the strongest 1, 2, 3 punches of the entire catalog. Like going from High Velocity Impact Splatter, Sadistic Embodiment, and Killer Become. Like, all 3 of those songs fucking kill it. What a way to open the album. And then, while the rest of the album's awesome, doesn't quite have as much memorability as the first 3 tracks, except Funeral Cremation. That is an awesome song in its own right as well. But yeah, while the production, again, a little bit more polished, it's still gritty, but it definitely showcases that the band was able to try different things and maybe go back a little bit to their earlier days, as opposed to like that middle era when they were just all about brutality and technicality. Like here they were getting back to more groove, more thrash, and more hooks, but still being brutal and aggressive. But yeah, my number 10, in my opinion, the most underrated of the entire catalog. So now we get back to a longer break. We get another few years before the next album would happen, and they would go back to Mana Recording, back to Eric Rutan for this next one, and released in 2017, we would get Red Before Black. This one is my number 14. Yeah, this is another one that falls in the bottom quarter, and again, it's good. It's still a Cannibal Corpse album, but again, not as strong, and also the production not as strong as, say, Kill or Torture, in my opinion. But still some killer tracks. Only One Will Die, Code of the Slashers, where they get a little bit, dare I say, death doomy? Firestorm Vengeance, and In the Midst of Ruined. Though there are some good songs on here, I'm not taking anything away from it, but this is another one of those albums I've listened to the least of theirs. And yeah, and also while the album cover and the album title's pretty creative, Red Before Black, like you see blood red before you go black and die, doesn't quite have as much character as some of the other things that they've done. But still, it's a good album, but it falls to my 14. So now we get into one of the other big stories. So over a year and a half later, at the end of 2018, again, there's so many conflicting reports about this, so honestly, who the hell even knows what really happened, but supposedly, some point in like early mid-December 2018, Pat O'Brien's house was on fire with loads of guns and ammunition and military-grade flamethrowers. Which, yeah, he's a collector. I mean, I'm a collector. I totally get it. And also, he'd be a hell of a customer to have at my shooting range that I work at. I think that would be pretty fun. But, yeah, apparently his house was on fire and he was seeking shelter at a neighbor. And a cop came by and supposedly Pat lunged at him with a knife or something. I don't know. Again, who knows what really happened, because there's so many conflicting reports. There were so many when I was looking it up back when it was going on. But, yeah, just a weird situation here. And it led to Pat being convicted on that, but also having sawed-off shotguns without permits. So, yeah, that was one of the big things that got him sent to jail. So, Cannibal had to find a new guitarist, unfortunately. But they would get Eric Rutan to take over on guitars, and he's still in the band to this day. So Eric Rutan's a busy motherfucker. Cannibal Corpse, Hate Eternal, as well as being a producer. So, yeah, busy bee Eric Rutan is. So, but with that said, long break, especially because COVID screwed a bunch of shit up. But they would get back to the studio, back to Mana Recording, Eric Rutan producing, but also on guitars. And released in the late spring of 2021, we would get Violence Unimagined. This is my number 6. This is almost like the modern version of... This is like the Corpse Grinder version of The Bleeding, in my opinion. There's so many catchy songs on here. I reviewed this when it came out, and I was blown away as to how catchy these songs were. Murderous Rampage, back to the thrashiness that Cannibal Corpse possesses. Inhumane Harvest, Conquest Condemnation, Contagion, Ritual Annihilation, Follow the Blood, Surround, Kill, Devour. Blech. And Eric Rattan's impact in terms of guitars immediately felt, and arguably Eric is the best guitarist Cannibal Corpse has ever had, and delivering some awesome leads, trading off with Rob, and they complement each other very well. And then some of these riffs Eric comes up with are just nasty. So yeah, Violence Unimagined, my favorite of the recent era of Cannibal Corpse, my number 6. And back to the quick releases. So touring back ad for these guys after COVID, and then they would go back to the studio once again in early 2023, and then finally released in September of 2023, we get the latest album, Chaos Horrific. Another one that I actually reviewed, and it made my year-end list. I believe it was in my top 25, like somewhere between 21 and 25. And it's a damn good album too, but it does land at my number 11, mostly just because I haven't had enough time with it. And I feel like the more listens I give it, it could go up. I don't know, the top 8 or 9, that's a solid top 8 or 9, so it could eclipse a Skeletal Domain, but I don't know. I feel like 11 might be a good placement, but still great album. It's another Cannibal Corpse album, what more do you want? But some killer tracks, Summoned for Sacrifice, Bloodblind with that like almost doomy start, almost like Morbid Angel, Fracture and Refracture, Drain You Empty being an awesome closer. Again, if you want to know my full opinion about this album, go check out my review. But yeah, my number 11. And that, ladies and gentlemen, does it for the Cannibal Corpse discography ranking. Yeah, this was fun to go through all 16 of these albums for nostalgia's sake. And also, it was fun to go back to some of the stuff I didn't really give many listens to. So yeah, but the legacy of Cannibal Corpse, not only the most popular death metal band, but one of the most influential and one of the best in the genre. Total consistency, one of the most consistent bands ever. No bad albums, everyone's good to classic. And I can't wait for what they have in store next. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. So as far as what will be my next ranking, well, it's not going to happen until April, and we have a nice, really big one to talk about, and that is Pantera. I can't wait to go through that and even go through the old glam metal period. That's going to be interesting. But yeah, we're going to talk Pantera in April. That's going to be fun. But until next time, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.